Welcome to Nick Reale Woodturning. So this is my studio, which is a dream come true. I spent 30 years in the fire department in Pinellas Park. And after retirement, I needed something to do and I needed a creative outlet. Been very fortunate to find such a great location and to find such a great community that supports me and supports all artists. So we do a lot of things here. What we do here is we try to do things as true to the form of woodworking as possible, and that includes furniture, it includes wood turning. We do have machines, but they're not replicators, they're not CNC machines, they're not computer driven, they're driven by human beings. And we use hand planes and hand tools. So this is an example. A customer wanted this shaped like a Seminole Native American paddle that they used. They gave me the specifications, and using this hand plane and taking it down and making the shape is what we did. But today we're here to talk about making a bowl, turning a bowl, and the method that I use to do it. I only use local wood, which means wood trees that have been taken down in Pinellas County, sometimes Florida, and I recover them. I reclaim them. Sometimes I go to the brush site, the dump, and pick up pieces. And they look something like this, where it's a piece of a trunk, which would be very big. And we have to process it. I have to process it a different way because of the grain structure of a tree, which we'll go over in a minute. So we take the trunk and we slice it right down the middle. So when we make a bowl, because of this grain structure of the wood, we have to go in from the side. Everybody thinks you go in from the top where the tree is already rounded, and that's the end grain. Well, when you carve into the end grain, it's very weak and the bowl will crack, most woods. So you have to cut it in half and then you have to let it dry. As an example, this is a piece that I'm working on. This is how the tree grew. So this goes to the roots and this goes out to the limbs. And this is the way you carve a bowl. This is how you do it, because you have end grain, side grain, end grain, side grain, and that makes a very strong structure for the bowl to hold together. If you do it from the top, you're very much just tearing it apart and it'll be a very weak bowl. The next part in this process is, after this dries in this shape for a few months, you take it and you cut it down similar to this, which doesn't look much different, but what you're doing is you're making the piece of wood smaller and you're getting the basic size of the bowl that you're going to create, and it's going to dry faster and more evenly that way than it will here in a larger piece. So then it'll sit in the dry room for a couple of months and I'll check the moisture level. So this is my wood drying room, where I bring the pieces of wood after I've milled them and cut them to dry. Usually takes about a year for them to do that, so I constantly check the moisture content with actually a moisture meter. And I have a dehumidifier in here for when the Florida summer starts up, so we can draw the water out of them. And in this room is all the wood I typically work with. This is banyan tree, and I was lucky enough to get a huge piece of the trunk from the Granville Court banyan tree. It was in the news because it was about a 150-year-old tree, and the neighbors in the neighborhood was trying to save the tree. Unfortunately, it had reached the end of its life, and it had to be removed. And when it gets to a certain moisture level, depending on the time of the year, I'll put it back on the lathe and I'll just make this nice round cylinder out of it. So maybe that's a good graphic, something like that. And then guess what? It goes back in the dry room and it dries for another couple of months. Then I take it out and I make a basic bowl shape, but the wood is still wet. And you have to be careful. You want it to dry as consistently as possible. You will get cracks like this if you don't. So this piece cracked because I've been continually taking it in and out of my dry room, and it eventually said, I don't like that, stop it, and gave me these cracks. But this is what it'll look like, and it'll be ready to mount on the lathe. Again, back in the dry room, a month or so goes by, and we're going to do a rough turning. So we have the basic bowl shape like we have here, and now we're going to carve out some of the middle. And we're going to make sure the wall thickness here matches the thickness from the bottom to here. Why? Because we want it to dry evenly and as quickly as possible. If you leave moisture in the wood for too long, it'll grow fungus, it'll rot the wood, it'll become a problem. So this is one of the last steps. Usually about a month after this, I can turn it into a final piece. Now I have a piece of sycamore here that already has, I turned a tenon on it so I can mount it on the lathe. And we're gonna do a rough turning with this, and then we'll do a final turning, and so you can see the difference, and then we'll sand it and put a little finish on it. And when we're done, and nothing goes wrong, we should end up with a nice shaped small bowl like this mango bowl right here. All right, so we're gonna take our piece, we're gonna mount it to the lathe in between the two centers. The two centers, the tailstock and the headstock. So there's some very sharp things that you line up with the holes you initially made way back when it was drying. And you give it a little turn and you make sure that you're in good shape. So now what you're going to see is I'm going to start carving and shaping the outside of the bowl. And we will do just a standard bowl shape so we don't overcomplicate things. Always have safety gear. If you're doing this without safety gear, you are going to be hurt. So you start the lathe, everything is spinning this way, counterclockwise. And I'm slowly creating the shape of the bowl that I want to make. What kind of bowl do I want? So now we have this really nice shape. It's pleasant to the eye. You have design considerations. You can see here, let me take it off. You can see here that we have a little bit of bark left of what's going to be the top of the bowl. So we can make a decision whether we're going to keep that or not. Maybe we like the shape, maybe we don't. But these are things that you can do as you're turning the bowl. So now we're using a special tool that really is only about 20 to 30 years old for wood lathes. They were used very much for metal lathes, and that is a set of jaws that will hold the piece on. And this is how we're going to carve out the inside of the bowl. But lathes have been around a very, very long time, 1300 BC. The Egyptians created a lathe that, of course, was human-powered. They used a bow with a rope to turn the axle. So it was a two-person, it's always been a two-person machine up until we got electric motors, which we love electric motors because they do make that easy. However, as you saw, all of the turning and holding the chisel and holding the tools is by hand. So this, you tighten this on, and it'll hold this in place while we carve out the middle. So we set this tool rest where we need it, so we can carve out the inside of that bowl using the same gouge. So these are some of our design concerns. We've created our outside shape. We have matched the inside. We're carved out. We got a good consistent thickness. But we have this bark inclusion is what it's called. This is actually the bark of the tree here and here. So we're going to make a decision whether we like this or not. And I've got to say, I like it. So it's staying in. The great thing about wood turning especially is it is somewhat free form, and you can play. You can see what you like. You can erase what you don't like and work with it from there. All right, so we have our shape. We like it. We're happy with the bark inclusions, and we're going to sand it now. Typically, I go through 7 or 8 levels of grit, starting at about 80 grit and going up to 1200 grit, which affects how the finish goes on and how the final product looks. All right, so that's one way of sanding, which is time consuming. There is a much better way to sand, which is using a power sander. However, that generates a lot of dust, and you need to have your safety gear. So your dust collection system and a respirator are very important. And that's a power sander. So we turn the vacuum on. So as you can see, the bowl has a beautiful sanded finish. Normally I go up to about 1200 grit, which is a very high grit. Our bark inclusion sanded out really nicely. It's a good shape. And now we're going to put on some shellac. Now shellac has been around for a very long time, and it's actually made from the excretion of the lac bug. And they gather these excretions off of the limbs of trees, and they break it down, mix it, separate it by color, and then distribute it as flakes. And then we take them and mix denatured alcohol and make a finish. So the first coat is simply filling in the pores, but it's a very natural finish. And again, we do this right on the lathe, which is really handy. Here are some of the woods we discussed finished. This is a cedar tree, all finished. It has a nice red color, just finished with shellac. We have a mango tree, which I love using fruit trees from around. This is rosewood, which is just about everybody's favorite. It's just a beautiful, dense wood. Some camphor here. A big camphor bowl always has those great red streaks in it. This one is a sycamore tree. Yes, sycamore trees grow in Florida. I had no idea until I got one.
You can see Nick Reale's work at Florida CraftArt, a nonprofit statewide organization representing Florida's fine craft artists in downtown St. Petersburg.